In this episode of the Smart Community podcast, Zoe speaks with Martin Tomitsch, Associate Professor in Design at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, Chair of Design and Research Director of the Design Lab, an interdisciplinary research group that investigates the role of design across a range of domains and contexts. Martin shares with Zoe the concepts of media architecture and hybrid infrastructure and how it can improve the lives of citizens in smart communities, as well as the importance of user experience design principles when designing smart cities. Martin tells us about his new book, Making Cities Smarter, Designing Interactive Urban Applications, and some interesting projects designed to use emerging technologies to, in one case, reduce litter, and in another case, make traffic lights not only fun, but safer. Zoe and Martin finish their conversation discussing the emerging trends of biodesign and cathedral thinking and why we should be thinking long-term when it comes to smart cities and smart communities. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
By the way, if you want to hear more from Zoe about her Churchill Fellowship trip, you should subscribe to her exclusive podcast about her Churchill Fellowship. It's exclusively for supporters on Pozible. So head to pozible.com today, search for My Smart Community, and hit support. There's several episodes there already for you to get stuck into and to hear Zoe's insights from the various people, places, and platforms she's been exploring as part of her Churchill Fellowship on smart mobility. So go to pozible.com, pozible.com, search for My Smart Community and hit support. Now, on with the episode.
Hello, Martin. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
No worries. I'm really excited for this conversation. So let's jump straight in. Can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, sure. My background is in informatics. So I studied and also did a PhD in informatics at the Vienna University of Technology. But actually, when I first looked at university programs, I was also considering studying business or graphic design. I ended up deciding for informatics because it was a broader degree than the other two that allowed me to learn more about a range of fields and then specialize. And it's possibly also a bit different to how we understand informatics in English, in that it had a strong focus on technology, on information technology specifically, also on computer science. But it then also include topics such as, for example, ethical implications of technology. And the area that I got really passionate about, looking at the way we're designing the interactions between people and technologies.
Yeah, excellent. Sounds really interesting. So what sparked your interest in this smart cities or smart communities space?
So I did my PhD in the area, or in an area where I was investigating sort of the integration of digital information in physical spaces. So it was sort of at the intersection of digital and physical environments. And while my PhD was mostly looking at indoor environments, I sort of started through the PhD looking into architectural design concepts. I also did a few subjects on architecture at the university. And I got really interested in sort of the opportunities actually that we have when we move to the city in terms of integrating information technologies or digital information in physical spaces. I first actually became interested and started working in a field that is known as media architecture. And together with some colleagues from around the world, actually, we also founded the Media Architecture Institute, which has been around now for 10 years. And we are running a large event as well. Every 2 years, we're holding the Media Architecture Biennale, which happened just last year in November in Beijing, and it's happening again in 2020 in Amsterdam, in Europe, actually. And media architecture is very much related to smart cities, but it has sort of as a field, it's a bit more academic, but also has a different focus in that it's not so much about the technology, but it's more about social aspects and spatial aspects. And that's how I got to the field of smart cities initially.
Yeah, cool. Can you explain a bit more about media architecture and like the relationship between smart cities?
So media architecture is about the integration, it's concerned with the integration of digital media into the built environment. That's really interesting because it means that we need to think about the built environment first as a physical space, but we also need to think about it as a cultural space. And media architecture, therefore, itself as a discipline is very interdisciplinary. So we are in the Media Architecture Institute also working together with people from social sciences, from architecture, from media studies. And so all these disciplines contribute to this discourse around how can we and how should we integrate media into the built environment. And so that builds on smart city concepts and it's linked to smart city concepts. But in a way, it's more connected to the social layer of the smart city. So it builds on the technology that the smart city movement has provided, like having sensors so you can collect data and deploying technology in cities in the form of digital displays, for example. And in particular in media architecture, one of the early prototypes in media architecture were media facades. So there were screens that were covering or are covering an entire building. But the field sort of has moved on from that idea and really is more looking at sort of integrated media across cities and more like looking at what we call also hybrid infrastructures. Because media is really completely present in cities now and allows us also to navigate the city or to make decisions about what we do in cities and how we work in cities or how we move through cities. And again, smart city technology is very important for that. But the way we use media in a way is more about how can this technology actually help us to make better use of the city and how can technology help to improve the life of people in cities.
So what is a smart city to you?
To me, I guess smart city as a term is more like a brand. It's like a label. And it's a label that has worked really well to establish that field, to get support, which is great. I think it's something that people understand. You say it's smart city and everyone has some sort of understanding of what it is. I think that everyone has a slightly different understanding depending on the background and what they're working on, the field they're working on, whether they're working in an academic field or in the government or in an industry context. But everyone has some sort of understanding and there's always some shared common principles that everyone has about this concept. Whereas again, media architecture, you could see from our discussion even just now, it's a term that I have to explain. It's a bit more academic, a bit more difficult to get buy-in in a way. So I think smart cities as a term was really successful in terms of getting that buy-in, starting a discourse. And for me, the way the term is being used, it is about using technologies to enable cities and governments or city councils to make better use of the city infrastructure and to design better cities in many ways. And then it comes down to how do we define better? Is that more efficient and more effective cities? Or are we talking also about the quality of life, for example, in cities and maybe about economic values as well, maybe. So smart cities, the fact that we managed to get sort of attention through this term, I think helped to create a discourse. And that was really important, I think, having this global discourse. But the reason why I don't necessarily think it's a term that will stick around because at some stage, all cities will be smart in some way because all cities will be built on the same technology or using similar technologies. So it's a term that is around for a little bit and it works quite well right now, but it's also probably going to change again.
Yeah, I agree. I use the term smart community. I know like smart city kind of gets attention, but again, I think community invokes in me like the people aspect of things immediately, whereas smart city term just didn't resonate as much on that people side of things. And I think also like smart community, that might disappear as well, and that's totally fine. But and I've heard intelligent communities and all these terms, but yeah, that fundamental kind of bring it back to, well, how do we do things differently to make things better and defining what better means for, the people in our communities. So, and I think also like for me, I'm really interested in making government processes more efficient because then we can have more time, money, effort, resources to spend time or to allocate to those more kind of, what's the word? Like the joy of our community, I guess. And I think like rather than just thinking that smart city or smart communities is this big, like, oh, well, eventually we will be a smart city. And because that's quite overwhelming, right? Oh, let's change everything now to this brand new thing that will make life easier and better for everybody. I think if we start that incremental change and people can see it and touch it and feel it, but then also there's stuff going on in the background where we're saving money, we're saving time, we're saving resources, and we're also saving the planet because, hey, that's like the imperative that, how do we kind of...
We've only got one, exactly.
Yeah, bring that together. The more I talk to people, the more it's becoming really apparent that we don't have a choice in this. We have to use things more efficiently. We have to use our resource more efficiently. But then also we want to, how do we do that in a way that we also have that not happiness. The term is, just making sure that people have a good quality of life, I guess.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. And also, how do you know you have now achieved a smart city? I think there were some countries were announcing that they were going to build 100 smart cities. I think it was in there in a certain period of time. I mean, what does that mean? Like, when have you achieved a smart city? And it's really not about that. And I agree with your what you're saying about government processes and communities, and in particular because city governments, city councils have to be often very creative because they're all working with very small budgets, and they're also highly scrutinized by the public because everything they do is very public. And so being able to improve those processes, and at the same time also, I think what was really good with the smart cities, what happened with the smart cities movement globally is that it actually made a lot of resources available, I think, to city governments and councils. So they started to have access to those resources and being able to more easily implement or change processes within their councils, within the city councils. But again, it's very vague in terms of what is a smart city. And when people initially started sort of spreading, or that word started spreading and people using that term, it was like one of the key things was that a city has a public Wi-Fi. And that's a smart city. That was one of the key principles of a smart city. But that's not really what smart cities are necessarily about.
And it's not to say that won't fit into it won't fit into the smart community. It's not to say that you wouldn't have that, but it really will depend on that individual community's needs. What are the pain points first, rather than just, here's a list of technologies, let's put it in this community and call it a smart community and then tick a box.
That's right. And so that's also an area that I'm really interested in, specifically within smart cities, because out of my background in studying informatics, I focus a lot on what is known as user experience design. And that's a growing field, still a growing field. And also here at the University of Sydney, we're teaching programs in user experience design. And we can see that our graduates are really high in demand in the industry because all the big banks, insurance companies, and also agencies, consulting companies are looking at building up their own design capabilities. And user experience design is really important because technology is really penetrating all aspects of our lives and all levels of companies. And so user experience design ensures that those technologies are designed in a way so that they're actually meaningful, intuitive and easy to use, but actually also addressing people's needs. And so what I'm interested in my research is how we can translate those principles from user experience design, which are not quite well established because that field it has been growing for the last 10 to 20 years. But it's not very much part of the smart city discussion yet. And it aligns with what you were saying in terms of having a people-focused approach and involving communities. And so I'm really interested in how can we translate those user experience design principles into cities and into frameworks we can use them for designing smart cities.
Interesting. I mean, I think we've answered these other questions, and I really want to talk about your book. So can you just tell us everything?
Everything. Yes. Okay. So I will give a short summary about the book.
Excellent.
It's called Making Cities Smarter, Designing Interactive Urban Applications. And it was published with Choice, which is a publisher based in Berlin. It came out last year in 2018. And it is really based on this idea of bringing user experience design principles into the smart city discussion. So it introduces a framework for how to achieve that. And it discusses and builds on known user experience design principles, and then shows through examples, and those are both international examples as well as examples from my own research. It shows how those principles can be used in a smart city project. The book is also really based on, or introduces the notion of city apps. And I use smart cities as a term very carefully actually in the book. And you will notice that it's also not in the title, not directly in the title at least. And so instead, I'm talking about city apps, because for me, city apps are really what is the interface between people and smart cities. So again, smart cities might be about all the tech and the data and the sensors, and how we collect all of that. And often it's about the dashboards that are created maybe for governments. But for me, it's really important. I'm really excited about how can we use some of this data and make it available to people in a way so that they can make better decisions or better informed decisions about their daily life in cities.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. And I'm really keen to hear more about some of the other projects and things that you're working on right now as well.
Yeah, so one of the advantages that we have working in a university as a researcher, as well as a number of advantages. One, that this environment allows us to really look into the future. So sort of look at future technologies, and often here in design and design research, often what we do is we create conceptual prototypes. They're often custom made. They're often so that they're not quite necessarily quite market ready, but they're sort of showing or demonstrating what a future product could look like. And the other advantage that we have is that because we are not working necessarily in a commercial environment, we can be a little bit more speculative and provocative as well. So often we're coming up with design concepts or prototypes that maybe can't be rolled out yet because of policies and regulations, but they're showing what would be possible if you're designing technology in the right way and taking a human-centered approach to that. And then the idea is that would then inform possibly future policies and regulations. And so one of the examples that I talk a lot about in my book as a sort of case study is a project that is called Tetrabin. It's a project that we were working on with a few of my students here at the University of Sydney. And the project started around the idea of reducing littering in cities. And instead of, we're sort of looking at other initiatives, and even the city of Sydney at the time had an initiative where they were running a promotion, like a campaign against littering. And we wanted to try a different approach. So we wanted to use emerging technologies to try a different approach. And so we came up with this prototype that rewards positive behavior, it rewards the right behavior rather than penalizing people for littering. And so we developed essentially a new skin for a city bin that uses LEDs. So it's like a light display, very low resolution light display. And it allows people to play Tetris by putting rubbish in the bin. So there are digital Tetris blocks around the bin. And when you put something in the bin, then the block falls down and you have to sort of time the way how you put the rubbish into the bin. And that the idea there was that would encourage people to be in a playful way, maybe to actually maybe pick up some of the rubbish around the bins and put it into the bin. And as you can see, this is maybe we're not necessarily saying that all the bins should have a digital display, but it's again sort of a bit of a provocative prototype to demonstrate what's possible. And interestingly, actually, one of the students that was working on this project with me later got into an incubator program funded by BMW, went to New York to actually start a company that is now running across New York, Sydney, and Beijing to actually develop this bin into a commercial product. So he's just launched his sort of second iteration of that bin through his company, which is called Sense City.
Cool. Going back to your book, you talked about the kind of research that you did in the international research as well. Keen to hear about some of the countries or places that you kind of researched in your book that are embracing the smart concept in a way that is that user-centric approach.
So there's the obvious examples like Amsterdam, for example. And what's interesting with Amsterdam is that they have, of course, been doing it for a very long time. So it's not just that they have a great approach to it, but they were, I think, the first city or one of the first cities that also had a smart city dashboard, for example, a very rudimental online dashboard. And so it gave that allowed them to really iterate their approach and to really move on from that technology focus quite early and have a more community and people-based focus. There are also quite a few projects that are coming out of Canada, in particular Montreal, for example. They have a lot of great community programs and like other cities, and a few examples that I've been looking at. Montreal is running, for example, a number of festivals, urban festivals that allow artists to develop prototypes, urban prototypes. And often those are night festivals, and the prototypes are sort of just based around light and interactions. And again, they're often more sort of maybe provocative for asking questions, but they're a great way to demonstrate again what's possible. How can we use technology to change the experience of people and their lives in cities? And those festivals are actually really great environment to test those ideas because they're sort of a safe environment. So people go there to have fun and to be entertained. You get an opportunity to actually get a lot of people to use your prototypes and give you feedback, which is great for us as researchers. And you also get the support from the city, which is really critical. So I've done a number of research projects. Like, for example, I worked for a number of years on a project looking at the customer experience in transport environments. And we're looking at bus stops, for example. And putting a digital display as a prototype at a bus stop is, for example, extremely challenging because of the regulations. It's almost impossible to do that. So in a festival, you've got an environment where you can be a bit more experimental because that's what people expect and because you got the support of the city. There was also another particular project that I'd like to point out that I discuss in the book, which is called Street Pong. And some people that are listening to this podcast might have come across it before. So it was developed at a university in Germany. And it uses it was a concept originally, a design concept before they actually built the prototype, with the idea to making a traffic light more fun. So what they did was use that little device that is a traffic lights to push the button and to essentially register that you're waiting for a green traffic light. They turned the device into a little touch screen that allows you to play Pong against the person waiting on the other side of the road. And so it takes away this frustrating experience of having to wait for the green light. And the vision is that would reduce jaywalking because people would then actually engage with that game. But one really interesting layer or element of that application was also that the game at the same time in the background has a countdown timer. So not only can you play a game against the person on the other side of the road, which encourages social interaction in an urban environment, but you can also see how much longer you have to wait until you can cross the road. And there's actually research that shows that if you give that information to people, they're less likely to walk across the road when there's a red light. So it's also, again, showing really a clever way of using data that could be collected through smart city concepts and making it available to people in a very playful way.
How do you think that we can better integrate across the different disciplines? You know, government, academia, industry, obviously, like a lot of these projects you're talking about have the potential to, will have to involve, many different disciplines and areas of government, etc. How do you think we can do that integration piece?
I think one element is having a discussion about this and raising the awareness that this is an important element, in particular if you want to achieve any sort of innovation. But also, and that's something I talk a lot about here at the university, and when I talk about also the role of design and design thinking, that this is really, really important to solve the complex challenges that our world is facing today, where there's no longer just one discipline that can solve those problems. So we really have to work across disciplines. And then enabling those collaborations as well. And that's already a shift, I think, that's happening, for example, in certain research funding schemes. You're actually getting points if you have people from other disciplines on your team, and if you can demonstrate cross-disciplinary collaborations. Similarly, at the university, for example, this sort of cross-disciplinary interaction or collaboration is really encouraged now, and it's something that is really sort of seen in a positive way. So that contributes to this mind and attitude shift in a way which is really, really important. But equally, especially if you talk about the future of cities, I think what's really critical is that we understand the role of education in all of this. Because those people who are going through high school and university right now, they will be the leaders, whether it's in industry or governments or research of the future. So for me as an educator also at the university, it's really important that we're teaching students now already the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. And that involves not just aspects like teamwork and sort of understanding of the other cultures and disciplinary areas, but also having a bit of a knowledge across a range of disciplines. And again, our university has actually moved in this direction already. They've changed their undergraduate curriculum last year in order to allow people to do majors from different faculties, which I think is really, really exciting. So we have our design students, for example, doing a second major in science, or equally someone who's studying science could be doing a major in design. And the other initiative that we've been doing at the university is that we have new units of study that students can take, where we get students from different disciplinary backgrounds together and to work on the project with an industry partner. And we actually also got a number of those projects that are linked to smart cities and smart city concepts. So I really think that education is going to play is playing a very important role in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that education piece is so important and getting people interested at all those levels as well. Like, how do we get more people interested in this when they're in primary school, and then they choose the subjects that are needed in secondary school and then university? And then similarly, like, just because you chose one career path doesn't mean you can't pivot and change when new interesting things come about. I think people are really scared or bamboozled by this smart city concept, which is why I kind of use smart community, because people are a bit more intrigued by that. But like, you know, it's not to say that like older people and younger people need to be working together in this space. It's not going to be exactly what you said, not going to be one discipline, not going to be one age group. It's not going to be one type of background or anything like that. We need actually that diversity, because cities, people and communities, regions, whatever, are very complex things. So you need very complex thinking to go with that. I think it's not going to be just a one kind of answer. We're just going to continue on the journey. And I think that education piece is so important, because people think that they can't be part of the conversation if they're not, you know, don't understand like IoT or blockchain or whatever. But I think that someone else will bring that knowledge, and you just have to understand how important all those different areas are.
I absolutely agree. And being able to then also communicate across those disciplinary boundaries, because you're right, often I think that sort of there's a bit of a fear or anxiety element, that because we don't quite understand the concept, that we feel we can't be part of the discussion. But it's really important almost to teach it as a soft skill, sort of that ability to be able to communicate across the disciplinary boundaries and to be able to understand people from different technical backgrounds.
So what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Well, something that I've been thinking a lot about in the last year, especially, is the role of biodesign. And that's sort of bringing design and science together, which is quite interesting in that also it's, in a way, advancing the role of design. So the last wave was bringing design and technology together, and that's how user experience design emerged, sort of like all the websites, apps, all of that came out of that movement. But with scientific methods and technologies and understanding advancing, there's also now more opportunities to bring design into that conversation as well. And so to get people with a background in biology or science to work together with designers to better understand how these new technologies can be applied. And it's a bit of a global trend. And for example, just to give you one example, the shoe company Puma, they released a shoe last year, a sort of concept shoe that is based on biodesign. So it uses bacteria and microorganisms in order to monitor an athlete's performance and then give the athlete feedback about that, and also to essentially curb very personalized air ventilation passageways in the shoe based on the individual's athlete's performance and needs. And so this is really opening up very cool opportunities, I think, in terms of the design, in terms of designing new applications. And it's something that hasn't really been done much for cities. There are a few companies, like there's a sort of conceptual architecture firm in New York called Terraform. They're doing a bit of that work, but it's really quite interesting to look at what are the opportunities of biodesign for cities. That's one element. And then the other area that is going to be more and more important in the future, and sort of possibly becoming a trend, hopefully becoming a trend. And it's also linked to what you said already about the planet and sort of thinking about planetary health and how smart cities are connected to planetary health. And that's something that I'm also currently working on with a colleague of mine, Professor Markus Fott from Queensland University of Technology, sort of the idea of thinking about what he refers to as modern human design. So it sort of takes the idea of human-centered design, but then it goes beyond that and says that actually we also need to consider other elements such as environment and natural systems, for example, in our design process, which is currently often overlooked. So if you're just trying to maximize the benefit for people, there's a risk that actually we're damaging the planet long-term, and then actually also damaging the well-being of people as well at the same time. But also long-term effects, so they're much more difficult to study. And so one concept that I've been looking at that sort of supports that way of thinking is this term or the notion of cathedral thinking. So it's based on the idea that back when cathedrals were built, the architect who was starting with the design of the cathedral knew that he would not be alive by the time the cathedral was finished. So it's therefore a call to consider the long-term implications of the long-term impact of our actions and of how we're designing systems beyond our short lifespans.
Wow, that's so interesting. And Marcus was on the podcast very early on. I meant to mention that. And yeah, I love talking to him every time I run into him at a conference. And the idea of biodesign, I'll just go back because I've been looking at that myself and hoping to get somebody on to talk about it. So thanks for mentioning it, because I think there's so much potential in that space, with energy generation and looking to nature. And I don't think it's as science fiction-y as we think, it is, or it always kind of starts with this kind of out there concept. But I think we can totally learn from nature. And I think the academic industry really helps with that because, you can try and test things without having to sell it to consumers. So thanks so much for mentioning that because, I want to probably do a whole podcast on it because there's so much. I'm really keen to see what's emerging in that space because I hadn't really done any research in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely at least a whole podcast in that topic.
Totally. Thanks so much for coming on to the podcast, Martin. It's been absolutely fantastic to speak with you, and we'll have to catch up in person next time I'm down in Sydney. That'd be really great.
That'd be great. Yeah, no, you're welcome. It was really great to chat to you.
Awesome. I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn by searching for my name, Martin Tomitsch. And I'm also on Twitter. My handle there is Martin Tom. And I'm also on Instagram, and my handle there is Martin Tomitsch, all in one word.
Excellent. We'll put all the links to your socials in the show notes, as well as a link to your book as well. And yeah, thanks again for coming on to the podcast.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again for chatting to me.
No worries. Talk soon.
Okay. Bye.
See ya. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community or find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter @SmartComPod. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears, so thank you in advance. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.